It has been just over 64 years since the end of the Korean War, yet the tensions that still resonate between North Korea, South Korea, and the rest of the world have never been higher. As quoted by former South Korean President Kim Young-sam, it's very certain that North Korea is developing nuclear weapons for offensive purposes. They do not need nuclear weapons to defend their own country. With each passing day, our country is once again increasing its sanctions against North Korea, leaving the country reeling with anger and frustration at the impending economically devastating effects. North Korean aggression is a issue that was raised out of the fallout of World War II. It was previously owned by the Japanese Empire. It was forfeited in the negotiations in Geneva. The Soviet Union and the United States were tasked with deciding what would happen afterwards. It would be subsequently split along the 38th parallel, dividing the Soviet-endorsed North from the South, whose only ally was the reluctant United States. An election is proposed by the United Nations General Assembly, though the Soviet Union is opposed. The election does ensue. Eventually, the South decides that they wish to put together a national assembly of their own, where the Republic of South Korea arises. The North rejects their offer to do the same, inevitably creating the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. The South Korea is led by Syngman Rhee, and North Korea has a dictator who is Kim Il-sung. Eventually, the tensions along the border grew, and small altercations shifted to a border breach of an indiscernible number of soldiers. It was moving towards Seoul, South Korea's capital. According to the History Channel, nearly 10,000 soldiers died before the war even began. As retold by the Department of State's Office of the Historian, there was a top-secret report completed on April 7, 1950, that argued that the best course of action was to respond with a kind of massive buildup of the U.S. military and its weaponry. The report was called NSC-68 and was not declassified until 1975. In short, this report essentially details the perceived communist threat from the East and how the U.S. should retaliate. After the Republic of Korea declares independence, a Soviet-backed North invades the South in June 25, 1950, with numbers ranging in the tens of thousands. In response, the United States nearly triples its defense spending to help eradicate the rising fear of communism in the East. Only 5 days after the beginning of the invasion, President Harry Truman issues ground troops in North Korea. The Korean War continues for nearly a year before a ceasefire is proposed, and truce talks ensue for 2 years before anything actually begins. The terms of an armistice would finally be reached on July 27, 1953, spurring the creation of the DMZ, or the Demilitarized Zone, along the 38th parallel, and voluntary reparations of POWs, which means prisoners of war would be allowed to repatriate themselves with whichever country they wish to. According to CNN, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the Chinese People's Volunteers, and the UN signed an armistice agreement. The Republic of Korea refused to sign. However, hostilities cease within 12 hours. The creation of the DMZ begins, and to this day, each side is constantly patrolling around the clock. In April of 1996, Kim Jong-il partially reignites the war, sending thousands of troops to the DMZ. All of this follows its slow build to the breakaway, leaving the 1985 International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and only a mere year later opening a nuclear reactor and sending a medium-range rocket over the Sea of Japan in 1993. 10 years later, in 2003, North Korea looked towards the South for amnesty. Kim Jong-il agrees to meet with his South Korean counterpart, Kim Dae-jung, where negotiations reopen border offices and reunify families after South grants 3,500 soldiers to be repatriated with their country. A historical handshake between Jong-il and Dae-jung sparks a spontaneous admission from North Korea that, according to the BBC website, it is secretly developing a uranium-based nuclear program, which forced the United States, Japan, and South Korea to immediately cease all oil shipments. Inevitably, the sanctions imposed on North Korea would compel them to reopen their nuclear facilities in Yongbyon and force the UN inspectors previously placed there to ensure that they would never rebuild their nuclear programs. After the North broke from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it left the remaining 5 countries, China, South Korea, the US, Japan, and Russia, to deal with the growing possibility of a nuclearized North Korea. At times of great tension, the North threatens the use of nuclear power, testing long-range missiles over an unsuspecting Japan, only to turn to the rest of the world and ask for their aid. They have utilized their nuclear threat in the past to gain leverage against the rest of the world. In 2006, 2009, and 2013, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea tested these nuclear weapons underground, all the while test-firing long-range missiles with the claims of it being able to reach the US. There are countless times where the United Nations and allied countries have imposed sanctions on North Korea's oil shipments and consumptions. In response to the recent nuclear and long-range missile tests, according to Richard Gonzalez of NPR, the new sanctions set a cap on crude and refined oil exports at 8.5 million barrels per year, which represents nearly 30% of what they consume. The Security Council's resolution also bans North Korea's textile imports worth an average of $760 million over the past 3 years. Ideologies and festering wounds and hatred harbored from the early 50s, all are reasons why the US, China, and North Korea are in an incessant death roll, constantly crossing each other's lines drawn in the sand only to rescind the offensive comments thrown. The US government cannot at least align, if the US government cannot at least align themselves with the Chinese government, finding a plan that works decisively on both sides, there will never be any agreement. North Korea relies heavily on its largest ally, China, meaning if the United States could impose sanctions that the Chinese could also back, then the ability of North Korea to retaliate would lessen. The main objective of the recent crippling sanctions imposed against North Korea is to finally eradicate Kim Jong-un's nuclear ability and overall military threat. If the tensions between the United States and North Korea do not dissolve, there could be catastrophic fallout from the possible war that would ensue. There are roughly minutes before an entire country could be devastated because of the inability of governments to align themselves or their ideologies. Thank you.